Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us. For those of you who are here live and for those of you listening to the recording, I'm happy we get to do this together. Dr. Grunfeld, as we've discussed this year in our Beis Yaakov course, and for those of you who are already familiar with her life, you know that she was really an inspirational figure. She accomplished so many amazing things in her life. She was really just, an incredible person. And we're going to hopefully get to highlight a few of the major things that she is known for and that we really feel her impacts very strongly in the Jewish community. Before we start, I just want to show you a picture of her. So you can see there are a lot of pictures available of her. Um, This one is her, of course, when she was younger. And you just see in every picture, she always has a huge smile. She was just, and you can see in her writings and stories about her and everything, she just had a really like happy personality and just, you just see she's very, very charming and very beautiful. Um, Her Yahrtzeit is Lag BaOmer, so we're just doing this a little bit early to be more convenient. Somewhere, so we can discuss this at a better time. But we'll keep in mind that this week, Monday night and Tuesday is Lag BaOmer, and that is her yard site. She was born in 1902, and she was born into in she grew up in Frankfurt, Germany, which was very much impacted right by Ruth Hirsch. And she, you see throughout, her definitely in her upbringing and when she talks about her upbringing, you see the impact of Ruth Hirsch was very strong. And really in everything that she did and that her family did, they were very much impacted by Rav Hirsch, by his way of life, by his way of teaching and learning. And that was really a major impact in who she was. Rav Hirsch's community was, of course, the community was really very Hirschian, right? They were really a Rav Hirsch community, even after he passed away, right? She was born after he passed away, but she still very much felt his impact. Um, and he also established, when he established a school, it was both a school for boys and a school for girls. So, he was, as we discussed in the Beis Yaakov course, Rav Hirsch was a major influence on Sarah Schneer. And we're going to see that Dr. Grunfeld was very involved in Beis Yaakov. Um, but Rav Hirsch um, impacted Sarah Schneer a lot in terms of a lot of what he did in his life and a lot of what he taught. Sarah Schneer used a lot of those teachings in her teaching and in her school. But also the fact that Rav Hirsch established a school for girls gave like a model for Sarah Schneer. And we're going to see that that was a major impact of Rav school on Sarah Schneer was a major impact. And one of the ways that, that was kind of brought over to Sarah Schneer's movement was through Dr. Grunfeld and some of her colleagues. So she was very much impacted by Rav Hirsch, and she really brought that to the rest of the world. And we're going to see also her husband, Diane Grunfeld, was also a major teacher, major follower and student of Rav Hirsch, and also a major promoter of his teachings and teacher of his teaching. So, Rav Hirsch played a big role in her life, even though she never met him. Um, Now she um, got a degree, she got a doctorate in education, and she wanted to use her, you know, love of Torah, right, and her passion for teaching children to bring Torah to more children in the Jewish community. And at that time, there were a lot of places that needed teachers. And she had a few ideas of where she maybe wanted to go. And when she went to talk to a Rav that she knew, Rav Yaakov Rosenheim, who was the president of Agudas Yisrael. And she said, can you, Agudas Yisrael was a network at that point. And she said, can you help me figure out where I should go? And she had a few ideas in mind. And Rav Rosenheim said to her, you should go to Beis Yaakov, right? It was a few years after Beis Yaakov started, and Agudas Yisrael had become very involved in Beis Yaakov around 1923. And they were really supporting Sarah Schneer's movement and trying to help her to find teachers and find financial support and things like that. So when, Dr. Grunfeld in 1925 was this very talented, experienced teacher. At that point, she had been teaching for a few years. And when she wanted to, go somewhere and bring Torah where it was needed, Rav Rosenheim said, you should go to Beis Yaakov, to Krakow. And she talks about how she was so horrified. And I wanted to mention there was a few sources on her life. Daughters of Destiny is a beautiful book that talks about many different women, and one of them is Dr. Grunfeld. Also, there's a biography called Rebbetzin Grunfeld um, about her life, and also she herself wrote like a few articles, and she wrote a book called Shepherd, which we'll discuss. But so you really in these different sources, she was very involved in each of these sources, even in Daughters of Destiny and the book Rebbetzin Grunfeld, she was being interviewed by the authors. So you really get to hear her voice and her experience, and kind of like really experience what she was going through and thinking. So she talks about how she was so horrified when she was told that she was going to go to Krakow, to Poland. They were so different. She was used to the Western European way of life. In the German communities, they were wealthy, they were cultured, they had a very specific way of life. And to go to Poland where they like the way of life, they were really like impoverished there. Life was a lot more difficult. Even like, basic things like running water and electricity and bathrooms, things like that. Like it was so it was so hard for people to go from like Western Europe or people who came from America to go to the yeshivas in Eastern Europe. It was really mysterious nefesh. It was so, the quality of life was so much lower than what they were used to. So, when she heard this, like to go to Poland, to a community which was so foreign to her, right? Even though, of course, they were all from Jews, it was so foreign to her, their way of life, their culture, their language, their basic standards of living was so different than what she was used to. And she was like horrified. Like she said, absolutely not. There's, no way am I doing that. And there were a few Agudas Israel leaders who were very involved, like Dr. Deutschlander at that point was also very, involved with Sarah Schneer, became a partner to Sarah Schneer, and he was a Hirschian, and he was also from that area. Um, and he sent her a letter, and he basically said, you're coming. He convinced her to come, and she replied to the first letter and said, no way, I'm not coming. I'm not experienced enough. Right? This was the beginning of a movement. It was, it seemed like a big challenge, and it seemed very different than what she was used to. And so even though she replied and said, I'm not coming, she then received a train ticket. And she said that as soon as she got the train ticket, even though she had been so adamant that she wouldn't go, she just, she said, okay, I guess I'm going. Um, and, it just, I think it shows us a lot about her. She talks about this experience where she was so adamant that she wasn't going to go. And then basically the next thing she knew is she found herself on a train to Poland, to Krakow. Um, and she says something pulled her. And here's how she talks. We could see really the experience in her own words. Okay, here she says, and so it was decided. I was going to Poland. I went out and bought a new coat and hat, took my briefcase with my notes and the commentaries of Rav Hirsch, and set out. I got into the train unaware that the step off the platform was a step into history. Everything she writes is just, it's so beautiful and it really pulls you in. First of all, I love this piece because she talks about how here she had the basic essentials with her, to be her, to be a frum person, to be a teacher, and she had, her new coat and hat, and her notes, and the commentaries of her Hirsch. That was, a basis of everything she was doing. She needed those with her. And also that piece of, the step off the platform was a step into history. She didn't even realize what she was getting into, but this moment in her life where she decided to just follow what was being given to her, right, where Hashem was putting her, um, changed history and it changed her life. Um, And here she says she talks a few times also about that first meeting with Sarah Schneer. Like she had no idea what she was getting into. This whole thing was new. She never heard of Sarah Schneer, and you know everything was so foreign, and she didn't really know if she wanted to be there. And here this is how she talks about Sarah Schneer. When I first met Sarah Schneer, she was 42 years old. My first impression was a woman full of liveliness, simplicity, and motherliness, not the pioneering personality of a movement. The simply dressed, mother-like figure walked along with a swarm of girls around her. My cart parked by the roadside, and they all swarmed around it. I was lifted out of the rickety cart, and Sarah Schneer embraced me in welcome. I found myself seated on a wooden bench under a tree in front of a small cottage. The mother sat next to me and began to unfold her dreams and the beginning of its accomplishment. From that moment on, I was under her spell. Right, so it took a little bit for her to get into it. But she was just overwhelmed as soon as she saw Sarah Schneer, as soon as she saw what Sarah Schneer had created. Um, it was just overwhelming. But even then, she talks about in her books that it was um, it was so like it was so exciting to be part of that. The students were excited to learn the whole movement. Sarah Schneer was a powerful personality. The students were passionate about learning. They wanted to be there. They wanted to grow. They wanted to become, not just become sincerely from women, but also people who were going to be on a mission of spreading Torah, of inspiring others to serve Hashem. This was a movement that was it was life-changing for everyone. And she, talks about how to be part of that, those first few years of Beis Yaakov was something that she never saw, you know, again, like that passion from everyone, that excitement to be there, and it was just a unique experience. But she also mentioned, and this is something I think it's just so important for us to remember how amazing people do things and what their experience is like is not always easy. Um, and she says that when she first got there, she felt that she just wasn't experienced enough. She was a young woman in her early 20s, right? She had been teaching for a few years, but she had been, teaching certain like, younger grades and things like that. Like this was really required a lot from her. And she felt that she wasn't experienced enough, and she also the preparation was a lot for her. It was a lot. And she says that Sarah Stier told her to stay for 2 more days. And she said she stayed for 5 more years. And she saw that there was something so incredible here and she wanted to be a part of it. But again, it wasn't easy at the beginning. She was, ready to resign, and Sarah Schneer said, stick it out for a few more days. And then she did. Um, and she talks about how even with that, even though it was so beautiful and as soon as she stayed, she wanted to stay, it still wasn't easy. She stayed up. She says that she was preparing until 3 a.m. And then she had to wake up at 5 a.m. to finish preparing. She was barely able to sleep. It was very taxing. It was a lot, but she put everything into it. Um, and she even talks about also one of the reasons that they took students from Rav Hirsch's community is because, again, they had received formal Jewish education. They were much more prepared for learning and for teaching than a lot of the Eastern European women. So they brought in a few of Rav Hirsch's students, Hirschian students, to be part of the Beis Yaakov movement, and also for other reasons. Sarah Schneer had a lot of respect for Rav Hirsch, and for different communities, and so she appreciated that. Sarah Schneer was Hasidish and she was from Eastern Europe, but she appreciated having contributions from different, communities, from members of other Jewish communities that were all devoted to serving Hashem, right? Devoted to the same mission of keeping the Torah and, keeping halacha, loving Hashem, right? All who were devoted to that. So Sarah Schneer was very excited to have different Pershians come, whether it was Rabbanim or women, but specifically the women. It was a real contribution because they were really unique, that they were women who were prepared for being teachers in a school. But even with that, Dr. Grunfeld talks about that. Even with that, it's one thing to have received a Torah education, but to be a teacher is a lot. You have to be very, very knowledgeable and very, very prepared. And she talks about that it really wasn't so simple. It was really hard for her. Like she had to really up her game to be able now to be a teacher. And so that's just something to keep in mind that even when she went and she did make that move of, okay, I'm doing this, I'm committed, I'm excited, it doesn't mean that it was easy. It still presented its own challenges. It was still a constant challenge, of being willing to sacrifice and again, all things we discussed. I mean, it would be hard for us to go to Eastern Europe and not have running water, right? That would be like pretty horrifying for us. But even aside from those things, even like not being able to sleep, just having to do everything to really make sure that she was a good teacher, right? Not just to be there, but to make sure that she was bringing everything she could and really making a positive impact. Um, but she talks about that after that, and there were certain times where she does mention that even after that, there were certain times that she had to go home or that she felt like she needed a break or things like that. But she always came back because she really wanted to be part of this. She saw that she was able to make an impact, which she really did. She played a big role in Beis Yaakov, and she wanted to be part of that impact. And she also loved it. She missed it when she was away. So she talks about that there were times where she needed a break, and things like that. And then, and she felt overwhelmed by the experience, but she also loved it and she returned. And again, I think a lot of what she shows us is that doing important things in the world, it's not always how you planned you would do it, and it's not easy, and it takes maybe constant sacrifice. It's not like, you stay up until 3 a.m. once and then everything falls into place, right? It's that there's a constant struggle and it can be difficult, but it doesn't mean it's not beautiful. It doesn't mean it's not, something important. Things that are important take, hard work. And also, she even shows like she loved it. She thought she wouldn't love it, but it was so hard for her to leave. And she actually even talks about that many years later, after about 6 years from the time that she started at Beis Yaakov, her parents wanted her to come home to get married, and she got engaged to her husband, Diane Grunfeld. And while they were engaged, there was going to be a period of engagement. Um, I don't know if this was meant from the beginning, but I think they were engaged for about 2 years. I don't know if that was, what was supposed to be, or that's what ended up happening. Um, and she says that she and Diane Grunfeld decided that she would go back for those years to Beis Yaakov because it was so hard for her to be away. So again, what initially horrified her became really like life-changing for her, something that she loved and that throughout her life she felt so connected to. And her impact on Beis Yaakov is extraordinary. So that's again something to just you know, go with like Hashem's plan. He puts us in the place we're supposed to be, and to be open that things aren't always how we pictured them. And they're not easy, but they can still be things that are beautiful and things that we love. And, it's meaningful to do something important. And that's what she felt. And to be surrounded by people who were, trying to grow, trying to learn, trying to do chesed, right? That was something which was really, she made an impact on them and they made an impact on her. Um, And her students, they talk about how much they loved her. She was very different than Sarah Schneer. She herself talks about that she and Sarah Schneer had a lot of different personality traits and were from different backgrounds, had different hashkafas, right? But that they worked, they were able to complement each other, and to work together to make a really fuller impact on the students. So that's something that's really just, beautiful to see how they were able to use each other's strengths to respect each other and to love each other. Um, as they should, because they were both, again, committed to the same mission. And that really made an impact on the girls. And they talk about how they loved Sarah, of course. And, like their next favorite teacher was Dr. Grunfeld. Like she really, they had so many important teachers that were just, you know, like very high quality. And Dr. Grunfeld really stood out of being a really like a teacher who had a lot of impact on them and who they just wanted to learn from. And she wasn't much older than them. She was only a few years older than them, but she had a major impact on them. And they talk about that throughout their lives. Dr. Grunfeld passed away in 1998. And she was there, she started in Beis Yaakov in 1925. And these girls were only a few years younger than her. So they all went on to have, major chinuch careers and, to do major things in the Jewish community. And they talk about how throughout their lives, they always looked to her like, she was their teacher, even though, okay, when they were 18 and she was 24. So, okay. But, eventually they were like all in their 70s, but they still looked to her as their mentor and as their Mora, as their Rebbitzin. Even again, people who were like, Rebbitzin Kaplan in America and Rebbitzin Bender in America and, people like that who were overwhelming personalities. But this was their Mora, who had made a huge impact on their lives. Um, and they called her Fräulein Doctor because she, like, from the Hersheyan community, she was a doctor, right, of education. And, this was something which was normal there. For the women in Eastern Europe, this was not something that they did. They didn't go to college and get degrees. So this was something that was very unusual to them. They respected it. They appreciated who she was. And they would call her Fräulein Doctor. That was like the nickname that they had for her. Here, let's see a little bit of how her students talk about her. And by the way, also we'll see that later in her life, she started off in Beis Yaakov, but later in her life, she also taught, both, she was like a teacher in Rebbitzin for both men and women. And there are many famous Rabbanim and leaders of the Jewish community who were her students. And again, these people who are towering personalities, who are just like what they did on the Jewish community is just like beyond. And they really look at her as like this is their Mora. So she was someone who, had a major impact on so many people's lives, and they always felt like she was worthy of that, of tremendous respect for who she was. Um, oh, here, sorry, the next one. Okay. This is from Daughters of Destiny. And again, Daughters of Destiny has different women. They interviewed different women to ask them about themselves or their teachers. So this is from Rebbetzin Basia Epstein Bender. And she says, our days were filled with interesting and stimulating classes. She's talking about, Beis Yaakov of Krakow. Though each group had almost every teacher for one period or another, there was one main teacher in charge of each class. My homeroom teacher was Fräulein Dr. Rosenbaum. That was Judith Grunfeld's maiden name was Rosenbaum. Of all the teachers in the school, she had the most influence over me. In general, she was a popular teacher, and many girls in other classes were jealous that my class had her so often. She taught us Chumash, Navi, Hashkafa, and a Torah perspective of psychology. And our students really talk about throughout the writings, in the books about her, but even in the other books, when you have like let's say Rebbetzin Bender's, there's a book about her, there's a book about Rebbetzin Kaplan, right? Pearl Banish talks, in her writings about Dr. Grunfeld, and they talk about like the classes that made an impact on them for the rest of their lives. Um, different classes even like, some of them talk about her Shir Hashirim classes, right? They talk about so many different classes of hers that they really brought with them for the rest of their lives. Fräulein Doctor, as she was called, was a rare combination of a solid Yiddish outlook and knowledge of the world as well. Her strong yet practical character made her more than a teacher. She was a friend, a confidant we could all relate to, someone who could talk to and understand girls from varied backgrounds. After her marriage to Diane Grunfeld and subsequent move to England, she earned the title of the Queen, and we'll talk about that later. We already saw these qualities emerging. Her aristocratic bearing had no taint of snobbery or pride. It was simply a part of her, something one noticed just by being in her presence. Um, and that's something that you see a lot from how they talk about that there was this aristocratic presence that she had, but of course, so humble, so friendly. There's just something so charming about her that she really pulls you in, and you feel like she's your friend, even as you see that she's someone who's definitely worthy of a lot of respect and, an impressive, high quality kind of person. Um, Okay, now of course, there's so much to say about her experience and contribution to Beis Yaakov, which, we talk about this in Levinos a lot. We've had a course on Beis Yaakov, and Yahrtzeit, we're going to have other Jewish history courses. And Dr. Grunfeld, as we'll see, she plays a role in a lot of different moments in Jewish history. So we're going to continue talking about her and her personality. But I want to go now and talk about another major highlight of her life. And we'll see like another dimension of who she is, which will give us more of a comprehensive view of who she was. We saw her, in one light now as a teacher in Beis Yaakov, as a friend and mentor to these, young women. And now we're going to see a whole different side of her personality and appreciate better who she was. So she married, as you mentioned, Diane Grunfeld, who was a lawyer. And again, in true Hirschian fashion, he was a major Talmud Chacham, a major Torah teacher, but also a lawyer. And that helped him in a lot of the work that he did. He was a Dayan in England, and he was on the Beis Din, and he was a leader in the community. And again, he used his, different parts of his life, to be a major figure for the Jewish community. Um, and he also is very well known for having translated um, many of Rav Hirsch's writings. And he also wrote his own Sfarim, and many of them you can really see Rav Hirsch's style in the writing. So he was someone who also, he never met Rav Hirsch. He was born after Rav Hirsch passed away, but you definitely feel Rav Hirsch's presence throughout his writings and teachings. Um, and he was, of course, his own impressive personality. When I had first learned about Diane Grunfeld and Dr. Judith Grunfeld separately. And then when I realized that they were married, it was like so exciting, right? To see that these two major personalities who were just both incredible, in so many ways, right? To see like, oh, it makes sense that they were married to each other and, they accomplished a lot of incredible things together. So we'll talk about him a little bit more. But of course, we're focusing a lot on what she accomplished. But he was a major figure in eventually in England. Um, And, they were part of a lot of the projects that they did, they were part of them together. And of course, throughout everything that they accomplished, their children talk about how they were always, giving their children a very strong chinuch, even with a lot of the things they were on top of for the community. So we're going to see a lot of how they worked together, and also how they supported each other, that they should each accomplish, in their unique areas as well. So what happened was they came back and they were living in Germany as a young couple. And soon after they got married, they started to see what was happening, right? This was the early 1930s. And they started to see that, they had to leave. And because of his job and things like that, they realized they had to flee. So in the early 1930s, they fled from Germany and they traveled a bit and they made their way to England, to London. And there, at the time, there was a Jewish school that asked her to join and to, be part of it. And what it was at that time, um, Dr. Victor Schoenfeld had started a Jewish school in London, trying to encourage the parents there to send their children to a Jewish school. And this was obviously, very important, right? So this was something that they were working on. And soon after that, Rabbi Dr. Victor Schoenfeld passed away, and his son, Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schoenfeld, took over. And he was very young. I think maybe when he took over, he was like 21 or something. He was himself like an overwhelming personality, and Mir Hashem will talk about him more because he's definitely worthy of talking about. Um, but he was this young man. He was very, very talented and very hardworking and just really unique kind of personality. And so she joined him in at this point, maybe it was a few years into it. So, he was still in his early 20s, and she was also a pretty young woman with, like newly, somewhat newly married and, things like that, starting to raise her family. And she joined his school, and he was kind of like I don't know, he was like, let's say, kind of the organizer of the school, but she became like the head of school. Um, and of course, again, this was part of not just being the head of school, right? But this was part of the larger trying to make a movement of encouraging parents to send their kids to Jewish schools, right? Which was unpopular at that time in England. This was a new thing that the Schoenfelds were bringing. And it had to, prove that it was going to be impressive and high quality and that kind of thing. So that was another movement that she joined. Um, and Okay, so that was something that she joined. But then soon after that, again, the Nazis were rising to power. And so soon after that, World War II broke out, right? And she was at that point in 19, like in like 1939, she was 37. She had three children at the time. And she had been in England for a few years. She was also, she talks about when she came to England, she didn't speak English. And so she took over and she started teaching, but she didn't speak English. So, you can just imagine like and that was also a different culture than what she was used to. So, it was, she talks about it was not a simple thing to show up, with everything changing in the world and in her own life, going through a lot of transitions and starting to raise a family, and also to join this movement and become the head of school and navigate not even knowing the language and not really being so familiar with the culture, right? This was a big, this was major. And then, of course, with all of this, the war breaks out. Um, so this is really where we see like another major, major moment in Dr. Grunfeld's life. What happened is that Rabbi Schoenfeld, who was again just a unique kind of person, he was very involved in the kinder transport. He saved thousands of children during the Holocaust, and he was, again, because these people were Hersheyans, they had they were Talmidei Chachamim. They were very committed to Torah and to things like that. But they also had an ability to kind of connect with the different officials in the government and kind of like be very charming and things like that. So she talks about that Rabbi Schoenfeld had like a lot of charm, and he was able to go into difficult situations and just kind of do what needed to be done. So he became like really a hero of the kinder transport, and he had a lot of children coming from, neighboring countries, and he was saving a lot of lives. And then they would come to England, and of course, he would help place them with families and things like that. So she, of course, had a lot of responsibility, taking care of the school and taking care of the community there. And he would bring children who needed to be cared for, and they would set them up in the school. And these were children who, again, they had, they spoke different languages, they had different cultures. And of course, this was a traumatizing time for everyone, right? Many of these children also, they were being separated from their parents. And, this was not a simple thing to navigate. So, this was part of Dr. Grunfeld's job was to take these kids who were coming from other countries and to help them, acclimate and to try to, give them what they need to try to help the situation as best as they could. So Dr. Grunfeld had, this was not an easy task, of course. And this was something that she was really, doing to be a partner, right, with Rabbi Schoenfeld and to do what needed to be done for the Jewish community. Um, and so when the war like officially broke out, um, the British government decided that, they were in London, and the British government wanted all of the schools in London to be evacuated to the countryside because London was bombed, that was, a major danger to be in London, and the British countryside was pretty safe. So they came up with this plan that the schools had to all be ready at a moment's notice to evacuate as a school, and they would be bused and sent on trains to the British countryside. Um, and they would be cared for there, and no one knew, of course, like how long this would be, what would happen. It was, of course, a chaotic time, and everyone's just, trying to do the best they could to just keep people alive, keep the children alive, And it was, of course, like a lot of chaos and a very scary time, especially, you can imagine like here they were dealing with children, and the children are being separated from their parents, right, brought to a new place, young children, it was a very, you know, difficult time. And so Dr. Grunfeld talks about this, that they had to be ready at a moment's notice to evacuate as a school, and go to the countryside. And it's just, she talks about this, and this is her book, Shepherd. They ended up going to the community of Shepherd. And it's really something which is so worth reading. To see her account of what was taking place. She talks about from the beginning when she had the children ready to evacuate. Here they were in a frum school. And she talks about how the older boys were carrying the Sifrei Torah. The younger kids were holding on to the hands of the even younger kids. They were, what was it? It was between 450 to 500 children, were part of this, evacuation to Shepherd. And they were mostly between the ages of 8 to 14, but some of them were as young as 5 and some as old as 17. So, she talks about like, you had 8-year-olds holding on to the hands of, their 6-year-old siblings or, to someone else's siblings and, trying to be, you know, trying to take part in this. It's overwhelming how she talks about it, how the children were so, um, really heroic. There's no other way to describe it. How they just, they were so ready. Like this is what had to be done, and they were ready. And of course, she oversaw this with, a few of the teachers, but she was the head of school. And of course, it was chaotic. They ended up being evacuated. They had literally a moment's notice. So they were evacuated on a Friday. And they were just kind of stuck onto random trains and buses. They didn't know where they were going. She didn't know where they were going. Like, there were multiple buses and she was on one and she didn't know if the other one was coming to the same place. And, it was like something which was really um not simple, and it just it was not simple, right? But she talks about really the heroism of these children who they understood what had to be done and they really rose to the challenge. And of course you can, imagine they had, teachers who were there to guide them and who taught them, right? Who showed them how to be, heroic. Um, again, it's really, really worth reading about yourself. There's really nothing like it. Um, and she herself had these little babies. She at that point had like her oldest was around 6, and she had like her own little babies that she had to be on top of, and it was just a very, very intense moment. Now what happened was they showed up to this to this village and the villagers knew that kids were coming. They didn't know who was coming. And so they assumed, like they're a British, village and they'll get children like what they're used to. Um and what happened was that and it was kind of random where people ended up. I don't know if there was any plan before, but they just seemed to get on buses and just be bused to whatever village, was available. And she talks about that they showed up, and all of a sudden the townspeople of Shefford were like shocked. They didn't know that they were going to end up with Jewish children. They didn't know what this meant. Like they had never met Jews in their lives. And she mentioned like some funny quotes, like, that one woman started saying, "Oh my gosh, it's the children of Israel from the Bible." Like you can just imagine like that's what they knew of Jews, like from the Bible. Like they had no experience, real life experience with Jews. They didn't know, they didn't sign up for this. They didn't know what they were signing up for. Like it was just very, very foreign. And you can imagine again on a Friday morning, these kids show up in this strange place. And what it was like for them. It was just a very, she talks about that day, basically, that it was so intense. And of course, with all of this, not only did they have to settle in, and she tried to help multiple children settle in. And, just remember, a lot of these children came from other countries. They weren't even British, so they didn't speak English. A lot of these children, they were 6, 7, 8, and they were, bused into this place and picked up by these random strangers who had never met a Jew before. Like it was a very intense moment. We'll talk about that in a minute. But throughout all of this, it's Friday morning. Dr. Grunfeld talks about how she didn't know where her children ended up. Like her children had been bused and they were on a different bus than her. She didn't know where they were. I mean, it was like so intense. And of course, she has to start getting ready for Shabbos. How are they supposed to get food for Shabbos for hundreds of kids and prepare it and serve it and find a place to sleep that night, right? It's like such, she talks about this like it was so overwhelming. And she talks about the experience of the children and the townspeople. They showed up, and these people had been told, like, okay, the kids are coming today. So they had prepared, like a nice brunch, and, they had prepared something to welcome them in. And of course, these kids show up, and again, a lot of them can't speak English, or a lot of them are very young, and they know they can't eat the food, right? And here they lay out this whole spread, and the kids won't touch the food, and they can't even communicate, or they don't know how to explain why. And Dr. Grunfeld said, like that night, the townspeople were like so mad. They were so mad that they had been sent these kids. They were trying to be so hospitable and so welcoming, and the kids were so rude. And like, that night it was Shabbos, and they would say to the kid, like, "Oh, turn on the light," and the kid couldn't, and they couldn't say why. And it was just like, here they have this problem now. The townspeople were so mad. And this, again, it's not what they signed up for, and they didn't want this. And she talks about like it was up to her and the teachers to go house to house and to explain to them why the kids were behaving in this strange way, right? Like, it's also like even when they explained it to them, it was still strange. And it was something, I mean, you can imagine, like, imagine these people have now been given the task to take care of these kids who they don't know any of the halachos involved. Like, and you could just imagine, like, that is so, they didn't have a kosher store around the corner, like, it's like, how in the world, were they supposed to do this? And really, it was Dr. Grunfeld's job. She and the school provided them with their food. They eventually had a building and they had a center and they provided the kids with all their food and things like that. So, she had a major job to be on top of, we'll talk about what she was on top of, so many things. But, this was not a simple situation. And what she talks about is that during those first few weeks, and to help matters, it was right before the Yom Tovim. So they had Rosh Hashanah and they had Yom Kippur and then they had Sukkot. And it was like one thing after another where the townspeople were like, what is wrong with these kids and with this community and what's happening here? And like for multiple days the kids can't turn on the lights and she says it was really not something that was easy to navigate at the beginning. But what she talks about is that really it's really a story of complete heroism, which it's rare for us in history to see heroism not just from the Jewish community but from these hosts. The Shepherd townspeople were so heroic, and she talks about that. And the children, these young children, were so heroic. And of course, Dr. Grunfeld and her colleagues in the school were just like what they did is just beyond. And what she talks about is that as the townspeople saw how committed these little children were to their halacha and to their Yiddishkeit, and to every detail, like the kids would wake up on Yom Kippur morning and they wouldn't eat anything, and they had to, make sure they were wearing the right shoes and they were walking to shul and it was this whole thing and they came to love these children and to really respect them. And she says something beautiful here, how she describes it here in Shepherd. She says, "But God's blessings undoubtedly were with us, and we found grace in the eyes of our hosts, so that even frozen faces gradually melted into smiles. Astonishment gave way to respect, and the more intense our religious life became, the more, by some miraculous intervention, the wave of goodwill soared up to encourage us." And she talks about how over time, the hosts and the children became so close that the host would actually encourage the children to, if like something was happening and maybe sometimes a kid might have gotten confused or something, right? Maybe a younger child didn't remember a certain halacha and they would see like another kid, keeping a certain halacha and they would say to the kid like, "Hey, why are you not doing that?" Like, or she would talk about like different things, different stories that took place of like, where the mothers would be, the host mothers would be talking to each other and saying like, "Okay, it's Sphera now, so they can't get the haircuts. So we'll make an appointment to go, on this date." And like they were so, involved and excited. That's what she talks about, though. Not just that they were doing this because, like, okay, this is what the kids are demanding, but that they were so excited that they got the opportunity, to be part of these kids staying so true to their beliefs, so committed to what they had been given as, children. Um, and it's just, again, it's just something that's so beautiful to see. Um, it's I wish we could really read the whole Shepherd right now because it's just something that it's, again, it's so life-changing. And if you haven't read it, I really, read it, and then I really encourage you to read it. It's just, it really is so life-changing. And what you see is, again, the children, the way they behaved, it would be hard to find, adults nowadays who could do what some of these 8-year-olds were doing. It was just they really rose to the challenge and protected something so important. They took care of the younger kids. They were so respectful to their hosts. They were just, everyone really brought their best. They, and again, I mean, yeah, if you look there, you can see the details, what they accomplished, what they did. It's just overwhelming. And again, the host and shepherd, what they did for the children was just they were so welcoming. You think about what the Jewish community has seen. And even by the way, the Jewish community has had a lot of interaction with British, with the British, and it was a lot of very negative, especially around that time. It wasn't like the British has not always been the Jewish community's friend. But these people in Shefford who never met a Jew really rose to the challenge and appreciated these children. And at a time when Jews all over the place were in danger and were unwanted and were totally not cared for, even people who were not killing Jews just didn't care about the Jewish community. They weren't trying to save lives. They weren't trying to make them feel better. They weren't trying to help. They weren't trying to do anything all over the world, right? We know in America, even in other places, they closed their doors. They didn't care. They didn't do basic things that they could have done to be a little bit helpful, to help save lives, or to care, to even show a little bit of compassion. That was something which was so rare at the time. And here, this community not only showed so much compassion, but they really sacrificed on behalf of the Jews who were staying in their home, in their village. And they did really so much to show love and to show, to welcome them. Like, again, there's a beautiful story Dr. Grunfeld talks about how they were given a building kindly by one of the people of Shefford to use as a center. And something happened and there was a fire. And she talks about how the community came together, the Shefford people, that, the way she says it's so beautiful. She says that even while she and the teachers and the children, the Jewish children and the Jewish teachers had been sleeping, the fire broke out in the middle of the night. And she talks about how the people of Shefford saw it and they started running in and saving the Sifrei Torah and saving all the Sidurim and the Sfarim and doing everything they could to try to save what they could. And she says in the morning when she came and saw what had happened, she was so horrified. Like here they had been using someone's building, and what's going to be now? They were so horrified. And she says that the owner simply said, he didn't say anything. He just said, I think there might be another building available. Go talk to this person. And she said there was no anger, nothing like that. It was just like, okay, these things happen, and now let's get you set up somewhere else. So that's kind of thing. Like these people of Shefford were so kind, um, really beyond what you might expect from even really kind people, right? They were out there and they were sacrificing on behalf of the Jewish community, on behalf of Torah. What an amazing thing that again she says, as we were all sleeping in our beds, the Shepherd people were running into the fire to save the Sifrei Torah. So, it's something that we should, of course, remember. This is, what heroism could be. We know a lot of heroism in the Jewish community, but heroism, everyone's capable of heroism. And it's a choice that they make. And the people of Shefford chose. And Dr. Grunfeld talks about like she showed up in Shefford. And again, she just showed up. She was on a bus, and the next thing she knew, she was in Shefford. Um, and she mentions like here's Shefford. She never heard of it. Like, what is this place? And she says that at that moment, like what was Shepherd? But she said after this goes down as a moment in Jewish history, as a heroic place and as a place that made a major impact on the Jewish community. Um, like now Shefford is a place that we celebrate and it has an important place in the world, in history, in the spiritual world. Like, what an incredible thing that it used to be like, what's Shefford? And now it's Shefford. And it's a place that really should be celebrated and the people there should be celebrated. And, it's just they really deserve it. Um, And of course, she talks. Now I see. I just there's so much to say now. I'm trying to, like, trying to go a little faster. But she talks about how much the kids thrived, how impressed. Like she says that a government official came and commented, like, as sometimes government people might come to see certain schools and to make sure it's passing certain standards. So she talks about that someone came to Shefford to look at her school in Shefford. And she was on top of, as we mentioned, she was running a school there so that they could continue learning. And she was also like a mother to them in many ways. She was providing food, she was providing, like all night they were with her. And she was, of course, like, guiding them. And when they were living with their hosts, right, she was playing a major role in their lives and working very hard. And the kids were really thriving. They really did, and even with, it was not a simple time, of course, like it was scary. They were away from their parents. Sometimes they would hear that their parents had been killed, right? It was really not like it was not a simple time at all. And yet, even with this really like this is like one of the most difficult challenges, that kids could face, right? To be like in this strange home that's not even Jewish, right? And that's so foreign to you and be away from parents, not sure if they're alive or maybe hearing that they're not alive, right? It's like this is so terrifying. And she talks about how much the kids really thrived and the learning was at a high standard. I mean, you think about like, maybe they would have compromised on certain things. Like, no, the learning was at a high standard. Everything was at a very high standard. And the kids really felt loved. They felt like a family. She talks about that they really, they were a family, this school. And she says that when the government official came, he was so impressed by everything. And he was, I think, looking mostly at the learning because it was about checking in on the school, I think. But he was still so impressed with the high quality of learning. Um, and, this was something which he says made a major impact because this was really the beginning again when they were trying to establish British Jewish schools. And so this was something to be able to say to the British community that this government official was very impressed with the academics, even during this like insanely difficult situation, actually went a long way in promoting this movement of providing Jewish education for the British community. So that was something which was, she was even in that crazy time, she was literally like accomplishing, a whole nother movement. It was just really incredible what she did, what she was able to do there. Um, Now I want to just show how she describes this experience. And again, she has a book about it and she talks, there are different speeches available that she gave. And if you go actually to the Shepherd Community's website, they talk about this a lot. You can visit Shepherd. They have a map for you to visit the different places that she talks about. And the Shepherd community is very proud of this. Like if you go to their site, you'll see it plays a major role talking about the Jewish children who came to stay in their community. They're very proud of it and the community and Dr. Grunfeld and her community, they were very appreciative, very loving. And it was really something that was, again, it was so beautiful when everyone brings you know, their A game, right? This is what can be accomplished. And here's how she talks about it. The children that boarded the buses in 1945 were different from those that arrived in 1939. They were older, not only in years, but in experience as well. We had successfully kept a community of children, united and loyal to Yiddishkeit, in a Christian village. Instead of melting into their society, we remained a society of our own, isolated in our beliefs, but friendly and accepted as members of their households. That's what it was. Could you imagine? These children stayed so loyal to Yiddishkeit. Children, so loyal. And yet they became members of their households. And she talks about that for years. These, children would stay in touch with their, for the rest of their lives, they stayed in touch with these families who had raised them. And a lot of them lost their own families in the war, and these were their families. And she talks about what was built there. And she says also for herself, she always, was in touch with these children who she also had raised. And again, especially the ones who lost their parents, like this is what they had. They had their school in this community that really became their family. So it's something that's it's so overwhelming. And again, what can be accomplished when everyone is really acting heroically. Um, And it was during this time that she earned the title of the Queen. And there's a funny story that they talk about in the book. If you look in Shepherd, the edition I have, it's a newer edition, and it has like memories from some of the children as well. And they talk about there was a funny story of how she got the name the Queen, but this is really like, when she got that name, they were all like, yes, she is the Queen. That's what she was. She was a queen and she was a leader. And she talks about throughout the book, and this is something really important for us, is she says, how were they able to do this? Right? How is it possible that these kids could remain so loyal to Torah, so, thrive in such a difficult moment in history, in such a difficult situation? And she said it's because of Torah. The Torah that they had received from their parents stayed with them, and the Torah that, of course, she continued to teach them, right, was a big impact. And because of the power of Torah, they were able to be people who were emotionally healthy, happy, thriving in such a difficult situation, and so passionately loyal to Torah. And some of the people who come out of there, like she talks about one of the boys that I think he was one of the older boys who was, one of those people who was managing, the boys had to help with managing minyanim and managing blowing shofar and building a sukkah and taking care of the Sifrei Torah. There were, some of the teachers who were there were rabbanim with them, but a few, and there were a lot of kids. So the older boys were really helpful in managing a lot of the frum aspects of life. And one of those boys became of Emanuel Jacobovitz, right, who was the chief rabbi in England, right? He was one of the leaders, one of the little boy leaders who was, helping to manage everything. Also, Rav Moshe Eisman from Ner Yisrael, he was also one of the children there. And he taught, he has articles talking about the impact that Dr. Judith Grunfeld had on his life. But you can imagine like this was their upbringing. She had raised them in this intense situation, and in partnership with their parents, right? And with these with their real parents, of course, and in partnership also with these British hosts, right? They together created leaders of the Jewish community and powerful, powerful personalities. Um, and of course, again, she says Torah was the motivation. It's what kept, it gave them a mission, it gave them meaning, and it gave them that source of happiness. Um, Now, again, after the war, she continued to be a major figure in, of course, the British Jewish community and to promote this, the importance of Jewish education. She continued to be a mentor and, a mother to many of these people. She also assisted, she has stories talking about she and Diane Grunfeld and Rabbi Schoenfeld and, if, those, some of their colleagues of the rabbis in Britain um, were involved in a lot of rescue efforts and trying to help, Holocaust survivors. There are a lot of stories talking about that. And she was very involved in that. She also, her students from Beis Yaakov talk about she would travel around and visit her students in America and around the world and talk about Sarah Schneer and Beis Yaakov and give them strength and guidance. And, she was just someone who continued to be a teacher and a rebbitzin and a guide and a mother to so many people. She had changed their lives. I want to just mention a few things that we talked about, but a few things that I want to just, summarize so that we can remember some of the incredible lessons that come from her life. First of all, I think you see, again, when we talk about her impact in Beis Yaakov, and of course, by the way, also, not to, this is also so important. She was married to Diane Grunfeld. And they again, this is there's so much more to say about her life. But she was really a partner to him. And it talks about what a devoted wife she was, that even when she was doing all these things and in these impossible situations, that she was really present with her husband, with her children. And her children talk about this, giving them a strong chinuch and being there for them and being there for her husband. So, that's something to remember. Like she really was like a real Ashes Chayil. She wasn't just out there saving the world, but she was taking care of her family was a priority and she was taking care of them. And she had, incredible kids. I had the privilege to interact with some of them and I hope to continue interacting with them. And, they built a beautiful family. So she, did a lot of important things. But we've seen two major things that she's known for, the Beis Yaakov, right? What she did for Beis Yaakov. We didn't even touch really upon what she did for Beis Yaakov, but okay, we did a little bit of a surface understanding. And also this moment in Shepherd. And what you see a lot from kind of both experiences. One of the things you see also is that she um she wasn't just like an academic who was, had a doctorate and, could like teach in Beis Yaakov and things like that. But she also was able to be a mother to hundreds of children. She was able to do whatever needed to be done, whether it was managing the kitchen or whether it was whatever it was. She was someone who everything she did well because she was passionate about doing what Hashem wanted of her, about being an Eved Hashem. And so it wasn't like, oh, she was talented in one area, therefore she did this, but she was able to sacrifice and to work hard and to bring her full self to whatever she was doing because it needed to be done and it had to be done well. It had to be done right. So that's who she was. And one of the things that I think we see a lot in her life is that she kind of ended up in a lot of situations that she wasn't planning. Again, with Beis Yaakov, she keeps saying how she was adamant that she wasn't going, and then she ended up there. And also Shefford, that was definitely not a situation that anyone chooses or expects. She talks about even when they first showed up there, she thought maybe it would be a few weeks, and then it ended up being 6 years, right? So this was, something she did not plan or want, right? But she ended up there. And I think one of the things that we see from her is that she always kind of, we see this a lot with Beis Yaakov. She really mentions it explicitly, but we see with Shepard also is that when Hashem put her in that place, she said, okay, this is like, I don't know if the word welcome is a good word because it obviously wasn't like something that she, wanted to continue, but like with Beis Yaakov, she said, okay, Hashem, put me here and this is it. I'm going to make a mark on history. I'm going to do whatever has to be done to be part of this beautiful movement. And also with Shefford, she didn't plan for it, but when she was put in this crazy situation that no one could plan for, no one could be prepared for, right? It's so crazy, but she was able to navigate it because that's what had to be done. And she did it. And she had the children thriving and she did a great job. And her kids even talk about like that they enjoyed being in the countryside. Her actual kids, they talk about some of the memories like as it being kind of a happy time. Like she was able to bring that to make it a pleasant experience, as pleasant as it possibly could be for the children. She was able to do that and to help them thrive physically, emotionally, spiritually, in every way they were able to thrive. So, it's just that's like overwhelming. And again, we don't always end up where we thought we would end up. Things a lot of times don't go according to plan and we end up in weird situations or just situations we didn't expect. But to just remember that, to accept it, it's part of Hashem's plan and to embrace it as best as we can. That's really our job is to embrace the plan that Hashem has and to do whatever we can to contribute to it. Um, Another lesson from her life is from Moshe Eisman. One of the articles he wrote, he calls her a bas melech in the public arena. And he talks about that, this was so not like, Beis Yaakov and Sarah Schneer and Judith Grunfeld. The goal wasn't to be like a public figure. It was to be an Akaris Abayis, right? And to be, and to be like teachers, they were often teachers and, wanting to build up the community, but in a sort of private way, right? In a more like Sanua kind of way. And he talks about that life kind of brought her into the spotlight and into really, not like private home kind of situations. But what he says is that this is part, and you see this from Sarah Schneer, and from Dr. Grunfeld, that this was really the lesson of Beis Yaakov is that the goal is to be like private and sanua and things like that. But sometimes life puts you in insane situations and calls on you to do something which is foreign, right? We as women, it's not like our essence to be people who are public figures, but sometimes we're kind of forced into that situation. And he says, you see with her that even though this was not, where she was trying to put herself, but when she had to be out there and navigating the situation between her children, right, her students and the Shepherd community and taking care of all these things and managing all these things and being a public figure, that's what she did. That's what had to be done, and so she did that. And he mentions one other thing that I think is so important, and I think this shows us a lot of insight into who she was. He says that with her, she was part of two major movements. Sarah Schneer's Beis Yaakov movement, of course, but also a lot of Rabbi Schoenfeld's movement, right, of bringing Jewish education to the British community, and of course, part of that, the Kinder Transport and Sheffer, right, all of what he was involved in, that she was basically like Sarah Schneer's partner and then Rabbi Schoenfeld's partner. And he mentions that you see really a lot of her like humility and her sincerity that this was being done for Hashem. Like she didn't feel the need to start, her own movement or do her own thing. She was someone who, I mean, in both movements, she was really doing as much as, Sarah Schneer was doing a ton, of course. Sarah Schneer passed away pretty young, and tragically, right, a lot of the leaders of Beis Yaakov were killed in the war. So Dr. Grunfeld after the war was really like one of the few teachers that was still around. And it really, in certain ways, she became like the leader of that of that movement. And Rabbi Schoenfeld also, like he was, very involved in the kinder transport and things like that. And she was really the one like at home who was taking care of a lot of the things that had to be taken care of. And Rabbi Schoenfeld was involved, but again, she had a major, major role in this, in the day-to-day life of this movement. And it was never about having her own movement. She was happy to just like, follow the guidance and the directions of Sarah Schneer or Rabbi Schoenfeld, do what had to be done in order to accomplish the larger goal of serving Hashem and accomplishing these goals of bringing Torah to people who need Torah, saving lives, right? Those kind of things. And it wasn't about having her own movement and her name and, things like that. Like she was just happy to accomplish whatever had to be accomplished and to be their second in command, if that's, where she could accomplish the most. Um, so I think again we see like he talks about she didn't need the credit, she was happy to just do what needed to be done and to make their movement successful. And that's something which of course, again is so beautiful and important to remember, right? It's about the larger goal of, serving Hashem and not about how many people know your name or not. And he talks about, and a few people talk about this, like she was called Dr. Grunfeld in her life. That was, a sign of respect. They really respected her, the girls. Even these people who, again, like people like Rebbetzin Kaplan and Rebbetzin Bender and Pearl Banish and people like that, Sarah Schneer. These are people who are really, really frum, right? It wasn't like they were so like, oh my gosh, college is the best thing in the world. But, they appreciated what she was able to accomplish, and who she was. And so they called her Dr. Grunfeld. And they're very proud of her. In today's world, it's something which is less, like, maybe like a less, I don't know, the title is maybe less like Rebbitzin-y. So, Rav Moshe Eisenman, I saw a few other people, the author of Rebbitzin Grunfeld. Sorry, I don't remember her name right now, but she wrote that biography of Rebbitzin Grunfeld. She calls it Rebbitzin Grunfeld, right? They talk about that, in today's world even though she was called Dr. Grunfeld, it's maybe a little bit of an incorrect way of calling her today because to us, Rebbitzin is a much more, like, wow, Rebbitzin Grunfeld. That's really what she was. Even though did have this doctorate, she was a woman of her goal in life was to teach Torah to Jewish children, to teach them about loving Hashem, to serve Hashem in any way she could. It wasn't some sort of, to be a career woman of academia and things like that. It was about being a Rebbitzin. And that's really what she was. Um, and the impact she made on so many people's lives, right, was through her. Again, it was because she was a person of Torah, a person who embodied Torah, and a person who taught Torah and who loved Torah and inspired her students to be committed to the Torah. And that's really, um, that's what she did. That's what she wanted to do. That's what she accomplished. And so, she's Dr. Grunfeld. She had all of those credentials, and she's also Rebbitzin Grunfeld, that she goes down as a mother of the Jewish people and a builder of Torah and of the Torah community. Um, okay. And I just want to mention, of course, again, her Yahrtzeit is Lag BaOmer. So we should, think about the lessons of her life always, but especially to keep them in mind on Lag BaOmer. And also, it's, you know, um, as we always, say at the end of our Livnos classes, like these, this is about how can we take this into our own lives, right? And remember that we are students of Rebbitzin Grunfeld, and we are followers, and we can accomplish the exact same things that she did. Amir Tashem, they should be in happy times, right? But in the happy times, we can accomplish a lot if we remember that, this is what a person can accomplish, what they can become, and we too can. If we have her as our guide and as our mentor and as our teacher, we too can accomplish a lot. And one of the ways I think we can start is by I encourage you to read Shepherd, to read Daughters of Destiny, to read the Rebbetzin Grunfeld biography. We at Livnos, again, we have the Beis Yaakov recordings available to be listened to. We're gonna have future classes, Amir Tashem, about her book clubs, about her books. These are all things we need to do because we need to learn more about her and to take the lessons, not just as lessons of what happened in history, but to take the lessons for our own lives of guidance for how we should be behaving as well. So thank you for joining us. And Mir Tashem, her neshama should have an aliyah, and we should continue to bring honor to her neshama and to the heroes of the Jewish community. So thank you. Yeah.